Hey, I'm Rodrigo. I'm an on-leave PhD candidate here at Stanford in Management Science and Engineering. And the reason I'm on leave is that I'm currently head of product at Neighborly, a community investing marketplace that I'm going to talk about later. Now, I've been sent some historical internet data by some friends that suggest that I was, along with my former advisor Ethan Zuckerman, responsible for popularizing the term civic crowdfunding and this definition, so you can blame me if you don't like the term. So what I'm going to do is start with a story of why I came to care about this topic in the first place. Back in 2011, I got interested in the idea that technologically supported crowds could overcome problems that offline communities have in accessing and building services and infrastructure that they need. It's kind of the digital version of what Ostrom called public entrepreneurship. I was in Mumbai at the time, helping to launch Condé Nast's digital business in India. And as you may know, Mumbai is a place with significant infrastructural challenges and many separated examples of community-based cooperation. I saw some of the earliest examples of young middle-class Indians reimagining the cities in which they lived through art, fashion, and especially technology. They weren't about to remake India's physical infrastructure, of course, but they were creating their own social infrastructure. Meanwhile, in late 2011, I heard about the story of the town of Glencoch in South Wales, a mining community about 20 miles west of where I grew up in Newport. A group there was trying to build a new community centre. The existing one was very popular, but made in the 1970s, it was falling apart. And for those of you who aren't aware, the South Wales Valley region is in some ways the UK's Detroit. Once dependent on a single industry, coal mining, its economic fortunes haven't recovered since the 1980s, when the decline of that industry really began. So fast forward to 2011, and the Glencoch community needed to raise $1.2 million for this project, and they were $40,000 short. And it may sound like a small gap, but it was enough to put the whole project in jeopardy. And at that point, with not too many options left, the company was put in touch with SpaceHive, a 4-person startup trying to apply the donation-based crowdfunding model popularized by Kickstarter to civic projects. No one in the Glencoch group had heard of Kickstarter. Nevertheless, the community took a chance on the new idea of civic crowdfunding, and they listed their project on SpaceHive. Amazingly, in 5 weeks, they raised the money and the project went ahead. This is the center in 2014. And to me, this was a really striking example of how to reimagine civic engagement and empower communities to marshal the resources they need, even in very challenging circumstances. And I was so inspired by Glencoch that in 2012 I decided to work pro bono with SpaceHive, collaborating with community groups, council leaders, and members of parliament, such as Green Party MP and former leader Caroline Lucas, who you see here. She was one of many politicians excited about the idea. And the other thing I saw was that many public agencies and communities were connecting for the first time to talk about how to build better towns and cities. Everyone around the table was struggling with financial constraints, but the chance to cooperate had opened up new possibilities to get things done. My time at SpaceHive was cut short only because I'd agreed to take up a place in a master's program at MIT's Center for Civic Media. And so I decided to spend the next 2 years there in Cambridge, Massachusetts, looking at this emerging trend of technologically supported crowds funding public goods. And by the time I got to Cambridge, a range of platforms like SpaceHive had sprung up in the US, Spain, Brazil, and even Finland. Now at this point, I didn't meet with universal approval from everyone around me. For a start, the term civic crowdfunding didn't exist. But I believed that what I had seen at SpaceHive was emergent and powerful, so I ignored most of the advice and carried on. Luckily for me, by the time I'd finished in 2014, civic crowdfunding was a term that people were starting to recognize. Now I'm going to save you the time of reading 173 pages and tell you what I learned in those 2 years, because I think it's at best the first half of a story we're right in the middle of. I assembled a data set of 1,224 projects launched between 2010 and 2014, and within that group I found some startling trends. First, most people want to donate about $60. Second, most projects are small scale, raising less than $20,000. Third, most projects happen in dense urban areas, especially those with high concentrations of college-educated 25 to 35-year-olds. And finally, the most common kind of project is a park or garden. I also ran into some complex ethical and political questions. One, will civic crowdfunding deter investment in the long term? And two, will richer communities benefit more from it? Unfortunately, it's still too early to know if these are questions or problems, but I do believe they are both very important ones to consider. So what happened was that I came to the conclusion that while donation-based crowdfunding of public goods has benefited a lot of communities already, it raises some tough questions around scale and ethics. It's really great at solving small-scale, uncontroversial issues, because who doesn't love a park? But it hasn't yet proven it can solve big, hard problems. So where do we go from here? I started to look at the incumbent mechanisms of financing large-scale public goods. Tax dollars, municipal budgets, and what to me was the elephant in the room, municipal bonds. Now perhaps it didn't take me so long to get to muni bonds because between 2004 and 2006 I was reporting on the bond markets at Bloomberg News in London. And this was the time when we were just starting to wake up to what goes wrong when people stop understanding how debt markets should work. So, are you familiar with how US cities and public agencies finance themselves using the bond market? I'll give you a quick overview. Public agencies raise $1 billion a day from everything from school improvements to transport infrastructure. The New York canals were funded by bonds. The Golden Gate Bridge was funded by bonds. In a bond deal, put simply, a city gets a loan, promises to pay a fixed interest rate, and in theory, any one of us can invest. It should be a fantastic, open way to produce public goods. But bonds today are a very Wall Street kind of thing. Call a broker and get in line. If you're a high-rolling client, you might just get a piece of the action. In fact, the two are so intertwined that back in January, Texas public schools had to pause an investment deal because of storms in New York. True story. But it didn't always used to be that way. Half a century ago, public officials used to stand on the courthouse steps to sell bonds for public projects. They called on the crowd to pitch in, and the crowd were repaid for their efforts. So what if we could connect the excitement and energy generated by donation-based crowdfunding and the appetite for investing in social impact to the much bigger, older problem of how to provide infrastructure, and in the process, reconnect people to their cities? Now, unknown to me, Neighborly, one of the donation-based platforms I studied while at MIT, had actually started out planning to help reform the muni bond market. But back then, Neighborly found that investors were not as enthusiastic about disrupting the financial services industry as they are now, and the team was unable to raise funding for the idea. So Neighborly decided to get started with a donation-based crowdfunding model which was much better understood. And in 2 years, Neighborly raised $2.5 million for donation-based crowdfunding projects. But of course, the team found exactly what I had, that the donation-based model matches small needs much better than large ones. So after 2 years of proving the crowd could be marshaled for civic purposes, their founder, Jace Wilson, returned to the idea of opening up public finance on a bigger scale. And when Jace told me about the plans, it was obvious to me that I needed to be involved. We agreed that because tax-free municipal bonds are a great investment as well as a civic good, they're a great way to go much further in improving cities. Retail investors buy more municipal bonds every week than Kickstarter has raised in its 6-year history. The main challenge here is getting those bonds out of the hands of brokers and into the hands of households. In a couple of months, we're going to be opening the first truly accessible bond investments in US cities. Our goal is to give more people than ever before the chance to both contribute to and benefit from investment in public goods, and break down layers of markets that depend on flipping to make a profit at every stage. And to me, this is very much the spirit of civic crowdfunding. It's not limited to donation-based campaigns. It's the opening up of inaccessible financial processes to involve everyone. And what's really gratifying for me personally is that we're already hearing We're not the only ones who've been through this thought process around earlier models of crowdfunding. When we asked some of our users the question, why did you sign up for Neighborly? One of them wrote, do something better with my money than funding another piece of lame technology on Kickstarter. I can relate because I've funded a lot of lame tech on Kickstarter. So I'd like to leave you with the thought that as we sit here thinking about the future of funding cities, we need to consider all of the tools we have in our armory, old and new. The rise of crowdfunding has taught us a lot about how people like to contribute to the things they care about and raised a lot of questions. We've passed through the first phase of trying to connect this idea to public goods and cities. I think the next phase calls on us to think bigger and bolder. I'm really excited to open this conversation with you and hear more about the things you're working on. Thanks for listening. I look forward to continuing the conversation.